Our session today is Global Perspectives on Programmatic Solutions to Bridging the Digital Divide, and our presenters are Madison Pearson and April Heinrich. They're from the University of Alberta. So I am going to hide myself now, and I will pass it over to Madison and April.
Thank you, Megan. Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure, I'll go. So my name is April Heinrich, and I am a third year at the Augustana faculty, and I am doing a major in music. And I've been a research assistant for the ACSRC for about a year now, and I've been working on the Broadband project. And this is my coworker.
Hi, I'm Madison. I'm also in my third year, also at Augustana campus. I'm double majoring in political studies and English, and I've been working as a research assistant at the ACSRC for just over a year now, actually. And I've been working largely on the rural broadband project as well. So for the project, just a quick summary, we've been doing a knowledge synthesis. We got a grant from SSHRC to continue a knowledge synthesis that we had originally been doing in conjunction with the Alberta government on rural broadband literature, both gray and academic. And so we're looking for rural broadband programming and whether or not people are focusing on programming and what the different programming solutions to bridging the digital divide are, as our title kind of demonstrates. So without further ado, I think it's time to get started. And we have decided that we're just gonna shut off the camera and focus on the PowerPoint slides.
Yes, so I'll stop it now, and here we go.
Okay. So until recently, the government has been focused on infrastructure and delivery of broadband. These types of policy solutions are more concrete and easier to manage and measure. We have been operating under the assumption that if we build this infrastructure, they will come, that is, people will come to use the infrastructure. However, this has proven to be flawed. Therefore, we must turn to programmatic solutions. What we've been discovering is that adoption is not guaranteed. There are subsets of the population who do not think that broadband is worth buying into, and this creates digital divides. There are multiple types of digital divides. The rural-urban digital divide is a result of easier, cheaper, better access in urban centers, as well as the differences in demography because rural populations tend to be older. The socio-demographic digital divide is caused by social determinants of broadband adoption, most notably age and socioeconomic status. The economic and industrial digital divide is a global digital divide. That is, the more developed a country is, the better access you have to broadband. So I want to just preface these stats by saying that Canada has a set of geographic challenges that are unique to many of the countries who are outperforming us. This is an opportunity for innovation. So in adoption, in OECD countries in December 2016, Canada ranked 29th out of 37 in mobile broadband subscriptions. However, we ranked 9th out of 35 in annual growth in fiber subscriptions. In bandwidth, Canada has an average speed of 13.1 megabytes per second, which does not rank in the top 10 average speeds worldwide. Countries with higher average bandwidth include South Korea with almost double at over double at 26.3 megabytes per second, Sweden with 19.7 megabytes per second, Latvia with 16.9 megabytes per second, and the United States with 18.7 megabytes per second. And in terms of cost, Canada ranks 23rd out of 115 countries on the cost of unlimited data. This is a link to the CRTC Interactive National Broadband Map. It shows the availability of internet access at the CRTC's target speeds, which is 5 megabytes per second download speed and 1 megabyte per second upload speed. The map shows largely fixed wireless access and low rates of unserved or underserved populations. The graph shows OECD broadband subscriptions per 100 inhabitants. Canada ranks between Israel and Belgium, as highlighted there, 29th out of 37. The common assumption is that different models of cost sharing or incentivization will correlate with increased uptake. Such perceptions fail to account for socioeconomic factors, tend to assume latent demand that may not actually be present, and neglect the broader implications of broadband adoption for rural community development. Our project goals and objectives include conducting a knowledge synthesis to address the lack of comprehensive reviews of rural broadband action strategies, producing an investment guidebook for rural community decision makers, providing sustainable recommendations for academic and non-academic target audiences, and facilitating opportunities for discussion amongst a diverse group of broadband stakeholders. Our main research question is, what programs and initiatives exist that effectively support broadband adoption in rural areas? So we hosted a workshop in June of 2017 in Camrose to share the progress and results of the project and to expand the use of data results and receive insight from a diverse group of stakeholders in moving the broadband discussion forward. The stakeholders were passionate and represented their interests well. In addition to discussions surrounding adoption, the digital divide, and their relationships with the community capitals, we heard a lot about other problems such as regulation and infrastructure. The biggest takeaway from the workshop was that the fundamental presumption we have made regarding broadband, build it and they will come, is flawed, much to the detriment of all stakeholders. So the 5 steps we followed in our knowledge synthesis methodology were: identify the research question, which again was what programs and initiatives exist to effectively support broadband adoption in rural communities. Identify the relevant English language studies. Because of our global scope and a priori theoretical framework, these numbers were well into the hundreds. Then we selected the studies and we categorized the studies, which the methodology of which we will discuss shortly, and then finally consultations. Now for data collection, we used keywords to search through Google Scholar and the University of Alberta library databases. We also used library resources, namely interlibrary loans. The research was driven by existing content. We went into the process without any assumption and let the literature define the categories. We are seeking to balance social structures with policy and development trajectories to make recommendations that will move the broadband debate forward in a practical sense. The literature we chose was broadly comparative on a global scale. However, our main limitation is that we were only looking at English language sources. So the literature review cross-references the determinants of broadband adoption with the elements of adoption in the individual work of the literature addresses and how. These distinctions were helped form categories such as rural versus urban, developed versus developing versus northern or aboriginal communities, size of community, metro influence zone score, technology, infrastructure, and social determinants of broadband adoption, including socioeconomic factors, gender, race, and individual factors such as age. These categories were cross-referenced with either a supply-side or demand-side interventions. Demand-side interventions include literature focused on interventions to promote broadband uptake by consumers, and supply-side interventions include literature focused on interventions to promote increased quality or decreased prices of broadband. Literature addressing the supply side is much more common because of the build it and they will come premise.
So this is what we ended up with as a typology. This shows the chart we used to sort the literature. The vertical columns are determinants of broadband adoption, and along the top are supply and demand and their subcategories, such as education, skills, public-private partnerships, and etc. Our secondary research question is, how do different programming interventions affect rural communities? To address this question, we used a community capitals framework. The 7 community capitals, as specified by Flora and Flora, are natural capital, any stock of natural assets yielding a flow of goods and services; physical capital, infrastructure that helps people obtain their basic needs; economic capital, how we allocate resources and make decisions about our material lives; human capital, attributes embodied in individuals that facilitate well-being; social capital, community cohesion and connectedness; cultural capital, project of shared voices, heritage, identity, and history; and finally, political capital, which reflects access to power, organizations, and resources. These capitals work to support each other, and all must be present to support a sustainable rural community. We assessed each piece of literature according to how relevant it was to each community capital. So through the rating, 0 equals no relevance, 1 low, 2 medium, and 3 high, for a maximum score of 21 and a minimum score of 0. The literature value is therefore based both on the overall score and scores in the individual capitals. This helps policymakers differentiate between comprehensive and more targeted interventions. Our synthesis shows a positive bias towards developed countries, with a significant body of work derived from Canada and the United States. While there are numerous outlier reports that do not fit easily within this typology, our results also show an emphasis upon regulatory issues, incentivizing uptake, different models of provision, such as private-public partnerships, and local government policy-oriented work. The supply-side literature is not only more substantial, but more diverse than the demand side. The consensus in the literature is for both rural communities and, more generally, the broader approach towards programming and uptake is to focus upon shifting the cost incentive structures of provision, either directly or through structural initiatives such as private-public partnerships. Such initiatives or interventions are upstream or distal factors in broadband adoption, as they target the market and/or structural factors affecting availability. Unfortunately, while the cost of broadband is an essential question in uptake and adoption, the underlying assumption of latent or unexpressed demand may not always hold true. When demand-side factors or interventions are considered, much of the resultant literature emphasizes shifting behavioral capacity through increased or improved education, skills, funding, or acknowledging the digital divide that cuts across different demographic sectors of the user and potential user population. For rural areas specifically, education, skills, and funding form the majority of the literature, unlike explicitly urban-focused work, which reflects a broader population and behavioral deficit for rural populations. Most of the extant literature refutes the common "if you build it, people will use it" assertion, but retains an emphasis upon utilizing provision and deployment strategies rather than social interventions. While supply issues and interventions certainly deserves continued recognitions, as high-quality services offered at a low cost are much more in demand than poor services that cost more, some demand is still needed to stimulate investments. However, demand also depends on social factors. Prior experience, knowledge of potential benefits, age, and income all significantly affect whether a person, especially in a rural environment, will utilize innovative broadband technologies and services, income being a key determinant. From a rural standpoint, increased broadband connectivity as an economic development intervention is argued to have a great potential for rural population retention, but again may not reflect social, community, and attitudinal dynamics driving demand. While the primary goal of this project is to catalog and inventory the broadband adoption literature more broadly, there is significant benefit to considering and assessing the broader causal framework within which broadband adoption is situated. From a rural development standpoint, and as the general results above reinforce, there is a long-standing emphasis upon rural broadband as an infrastructural investment for largely economic purposes, employment, training, communications, and investment. While such goals are certainly necessary conditions for rural community sustainability, the underlying model of linking rural citizens to an anchor industry or even corporation has a history of creating long-term path dependencies, exacerbating existing vulnerabilities, and in some cases even perpetuating boom-bust cycles. In turn, we are particularly interested in situating the extent broadband adoption literature against a more theoretically and practically robust framework for assessment. Utilizing the Community Capitals Framework, see above, this project assessed each item included in the review, which is about 440 articles, for either pre-identified, implicit, or explicit effects of that project, intervention, or study of on the community capitals. In turn, what emerges is a body of knowledge that is not only heavily focused upon infrastructure and economic development, but also significantly lacking in identifying, assessing, or promoting the implications of broadband programming and adoption to the other equally important pillars that support rural community development, resilience, and sustainability. When assessed as a whole, the content of the scoping review shows a significant emphasis upon 3 of the 7 community capitals: economic capital, physical capital, and social capital. While the potential benefits of broadband adoption for political and human capitals through electronic voting, increased access to political information, policy, and education, for example, do emerge in a portion of the literature, there's a pronounced absence of work that considers the implications and/or benefits of such initiatives for the environment, natural capital, and cultural capital. Given the breadth of material identified and used in this review, it is important to contextualize these results from a comparative perspective. Specifically, utilizing a most similar systems comparative design provides a brief insight into not only where the Canadian research and policy landscape regarding broadband adoption sits in terms of the community capitals, but also where other geopolitical entities have put the emphasis. The supply side of the typology reinforces what we already know from the typology in general. Articles focus on the physical and economic issues and solutions for broadband deployment. The most popular solutions for solving the broadband distribution problem are public-private partnerships, or PPP, incentives, municipal or community broadband, and the regulation or deregulation of the broadband market, with the same community capitals foci, or effects, as the literature as a whole: physical, economic, and social capitals. When demand-side initiatives are considered, a more balanced perspective emerges, with relatively equal distribution of materials through the different categories. However, this distribution still reflects a bias towards economic capital, physical capital or infrastructure, and social capital. For example, educational and skills-based initiatives still largely target or affect, or are anticipated to affect physical and economic capitals, despite the fact that education and skills acquisition are largely considered forms of human capital. The general patterns identified above hold consistent across a range of economically developed political entities. Somewhat surprisingly, the Canadian literature is somewhat more diffuse than other units analyzed, and leads to the possibility that while broadband adoption has some very clear framing and causal biases, the knowledge base for Canada has situated broadband adoption into a variety of contexts. For example, while the environmental, natural capital implications of broadband adoption are generally a very low priority, Canadian content shows the greatest attention to such effects, with other comparators basically providing no attention to this dynamic. Similarly, Canadian work linking broadband to human, social, and political capital is more present than in comparator states.
One of our key findings was the different types of digital divides and limitations in the literature. First, older people are less likely to desire or adopt broadband, but rural populations are increasingly older because young people leave rural communities to live and work. Second, not all rural businesses or sectors need or rely on broadband or high-speed internet. Third, previous experiences affect uptake and viability assessments, meaning that our history with state involvement in internet may hinder the state's desire to become involved in broadband again. Fourth, a lack of digital literacy platforms, and education opportunities is problematic, particularly in remote areas. So policy recommendations include broadband policy that should be demand-oriented rather than focusing on universal availability. Broadband adoption determines impact, not availability, including both public and private sector supporters in policy changes. Creating policy to encourage broadband adoption at a sectoral level rather than the individual level. Targeting non-user groups when attempting to improve broadband integration. Creating and supporting incremental differentiated broadband solutions for each rural sector. Blanket approaches have been proven to be ineffective in rural areas. Encouraging locally owned broadband initiatives which contribute to the local economy and reduce costs for users. Look to First Nations decentralized approaches as a successful model when planning broadband integration. increasing efforts to improve digital literacy in order to increase broadband adoption rates. Make sure to highlight the personal benefits of broadband and digital literacy. So next steps, we have completed the policy brief and the policy blast. We are in the process of completing the investment guidebook. We have had phone conversations with rural economic development officers. Webinars are also included there. We've managed to get that done, I think. We're doing press releases to rural newspapers, social media posts, ongoing collaboration with the Rural Broadband Toolkit, and ongoing collaboration with municipal and private infrastructure and programming providers. As the results of this review demonstrate, while broadband adoption can also have positive effects on workforce employability, population retention, governance, access to public services, community resilience, and the natural environment, there is a disproportionate emphasis upon the generation of financial capital, employment, and economic development for rural Canadian programming. And that's it. If you'd like more information, this will be passed around, but also you can contact Lars Hallstrom, the ACSRC.
Okay, thank you, April and Madison. That was a great presentation. I don't even want to think about how much reading went into this. Okay, so that concludes our session. And to get things going, there's a first question here, and it's, rural communities, especially older generations, have been able to survive until now without broadband and its technologies. Is it really that important to implement broadband and give access to everyone, even though there is a clear demand gap?
As I did the phone interviews with economic developers, most of them were talking about technologies and how we are evolving to become a society where we cannot live without technology. And in rural communities as well, it's already starting where farmers don't even need, for example, to be on the field, where they can control their machines from a computer room. And well, to do that, they do need internet and broadband. And just where we are going as a society, yeah, it won't be something that will be an option, and it for sure it's going to, we're going in a direction where broadband is a necessity and it's going to be part of every aspect of our lives.
And we just had a question that I think I should kind of share to everybody, just about the link and URL to the full report and paper to get shared. Do you guys already have, April and Madison, do you guys already have the full paper report completed, you said?
Yes, we do. There is a report that's available on the ACSRC.
We have another anonymous question. So they noted that you had policy in a few different charts. They're wondering if you found that policy was a challenge to implementing broadband, or if it was actually kind of aiding, or if you could speak more to policy and broadband.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
They want to know if policy was a challenge to implementing broadband or accessing broadband, or if it actually aided in implementing broadband.
Well, it depends on the type of policy and what your end goal is, of course. We've studied primarily, if not policy itself, then like perhaps suggested policy. There are instances where kind of the build it and they will come ingrained ideology has either hindered or benefited broadband, and that through the way that it affects policy.
Mm.
The category itself in our typology was a general category where we put policy suggestions, or if they were looking if the policy worked or not, or if they were suggesting policies. So if you were looking for specific articles about if policy worked or not, you could go through we are developing a portal where we will be putting our all the articles that we have read, and people will be able to go look for these specific articles if they are interested.
Cool. Okay, thank you. Okay, well, I don't think there are any other questions. So I would like to say thank you to our presenters, April and Madison, and as well as our audience for attending this session.